Well, hello everyone. I am going to record another video. This one is a follow-up for my simple production style C++ app where I created a digital signature remover app. Now this one will be bug fixes and improvements. It's part 4. If you haven't seen the previous parts, please review them. You will see the actual application that I've been working in. Okay, so let's start Visual Studio. Again, we should have the project ready, so let's open SigRemover. And there are a couple things that we need to do. Now, first, obvious typos. And then I also wanted to add one little thing here. Now, after we create a file over here in our RemoveDigitalSignature function, it would be nice to see if the resulting file actually has a valid checksum. So it wouldn't be prudent to do this for a release build. So let's switch to debug, and we will use a preprocessor if statement. And what we will do, we will check that our result is a success. In other words, if we succeeded. If we didn't, there is no point in doing this check. And then we will check that the checksum was calculated correctly. Okay, so how do we do this? Well, if we look, we don't have that function anymore, but basically there is a helper API called map file and checksum. Here we go. So this API allows us to take the file name and get the checksum for it. There's no point in calling it for the actual, in the actual production code. It's just for us to basically say that, hey, did we actually get a valid checksum? So what the API does, it takes the file path and then it outputs results here. But basically what's important for us is the return value to make sure that we get a valid checksum. Okay? So let's do that, and we will need, because it requires some input parameters, we'll just provide some dummy value. We don't really care about it. So we will do it like so. And let's just say, well, the word result checksum. And then we just write an assert to make sure that our checksum is valid, which is basically 0. But let's just use documented value. Okay, so this little snippet of code will be compiled only for debugger configuration. So if we do release, this snippet will be grayed out, so it will not be included in the build. This is just something for us to verify that our result is correct. So let's compile it. And let's see, we don't have any debugging information. So at this point, it will just show our app. Okay. Now, because we're doing kind of like simulation of production development, any change that you do have to follow up with the version change. So make sure that you upgrade or update the version to the next one. Now this one we didn't add a lot, so we just put 1 at the end, and also do it here. Now why is it important? Well, in case of an actual production app, this is how you can keep track of which app the customer had in case they had any issues. So right now you can tell that this is 101, and that's where we added all of our modifications. Now, additionally, if we take our app and run it with the help option, you will notice that we have only the input parameter. In other words, we can specify the input file, but we don't specify the output. The output is kind of like assumed to be in the same folder. We just, append a suffix to it. This is technically not the best way to program, because the input can come, let's say, from some location where we can't write to, let's say system folder. And in this case, the API will fail. Plus, you may not even want to write in the system folder. So it would be nice to provide an output parameter where the output you want to go to. Now, in case the user didn't want to provide it, let's assume that, for instance, version 1.0.0 was already released to the public. So in that case, for backward compatibility, if you remove that output parameter or omit it, well, the program will work the same way as the version 1.0.0. So that's what I wanted to add. Now for that, the first thing to do, well, the logical thing to begin with, is to change the help file. Now the change is kind of extensive, so first of all, let's rename I and F into I as an input. Let's just do file. Now I can remove F into I because this app was not released into production, so no one had ever seen it, so that's why I can do it. Now if it was released to production, I cannot change this parameter. Okay. Now for us, because it's simpler to do it this way, because it's logical, we do I as the input parameter, then in square brackets, which means that the second parameter is optional, we create the output parameter, which is O. Okay, and then let's see, we will create a new line, and here we will describe, let's say I specifies, because we have more than one parameter, so we have to explain what I and what O is. We need to write specifies PE file to remove signature from, then we put semicolon, and in this case we just have file, and let's just say P file equals, and all this stuff is not needed, file path to read PE binary. Okay, now this is kind of like tells the user what this is, in the file, even though it's kind of obvious, but also nice to give them an option. So let's copy here, and in this case it's O. Now this one is optional, so we have to provide it, and this one is specifies destination PE file. Now what we also need to add here, and I'm using spaces here, if omitted, the new file name will have, then we will fill in the suffix, so I'm using placeholder, we'll fill in the suffix from our source code. Okay, if omitted, the new file will have blah 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 suffix in the same folder. That's basically what the old version was doing. Okay, so then we have file equals PE path to create new PE binary, right? Okay, now we have two examples here. Now the first one is the same, and the second one, okay, it's not the same. We need to change I to F to I, and here it's O. Oh, I'm sorry, not O. Just the first one just doesn't specify it, and the second one does. So I'm just going to do copy and paste, and in this case we just do O and path to, I'll just call it result. Okay, so let's compile it. Oh, and by the way, we can't, as you can see, very good thing that Visual Studio has this warning. Basically tells us like, hey, There's not enough parameters for these specifiers, because otherwise it would crash. This is an amazing thing that they added, by the way. So what we need to find our suffix. Now, where did we use it? Well, let's take a look. We used it in this, not in this, in this function. So here we go. Now our suffix need to go on a global scale. So let's just add it like somewhere here. And so now we can use this suffix. Let's see this file, right? So we use it here. Let's just highlight it like this. Then we use suffix. Then we use to of this file. Okay, so now if we compile it, it should technically work, and it should show us the correct help. So this is what we need to do. We need to add this parameter. We need to rename this one, and then we need to do all this stuff. So I'm hoping I didn't put too many typos. If so, I will correct them later. Okay, now first thing first, we need to remove this and call it I. So we need to do a little bit of refactoring here. Now, since we are adding input and output files, let's see. Yes, so we will need to add, I'm assuming if we just create two local variables, yeah, if we just create them here, kind of like to hold our information. I'll explain this in a second. So input file and output file. So what we did before, when we encountered the f parameter, or I now, that's all we needed. So we could immediately start processing, removing the signature. Well, in this case, we can't do it because we have to keep going, and we have to process I and also O if we have it. So in this case, we won't be processing it here right away. Instead, we will put this into an input, into a local input parameter. And by the way, this one is I. It's important. And this one will not be here. And then at the end, when we are done with a loop, we need to see if we have an input file to work with, right? So I just check if it's not null. And then we have one interesting situation. Let's say we'll work with it a little bit later. So in here, if we get our input file, then we can say that we can remove binary signature from the file, right? And we can basically use this to do our work. And it will have both input and output. Okay, now here all we need to do is just remember, right? Remember it. So we don't really have to do anything else, right? And then we also have to process, make sure to put else if, process the O parameter, which is kind of the same way, except that here we remember it in the output file, right? So very, very similar. We have one interesting situation here. If we have input file, the output file can be null, so we don't care. But if we don't have the input file, let's see if do we have just an output. Okay, so basically if the user specified an output parameter but didn't specify the input parameter, well, in this case this is an error, Let's just copy it from here. And basically, let's say, we would say that O, command line parameter, requires the I, not U, but I parameter. Okay, so this is an error which we didn't have before. So now we had to add it. So, and let's see what else. Well, I guess if we have unsupported parameter, let's just remove both input and output because it's an error. And let's do the same if we have a help. So we won't process any files. So this is kind of like our way of saying, you know, if we have these special parameters, which is help, or if there's an error, don't process anything, just stop. So okay, so it kind of like cuts off this part. And so at this point, we just need to implement this function to remove digital signature. And what's going on in this case, now the old function, if you look at it here, it had only the input parameter, right? So now let's go to declaration and declare the output parameter. It's also the same type, and we would call it L string output file and assume default null. So it tells the caller that they don't have to provide it. And then if we go to implementation, we actually add it here as well. Okay, since we modified this function here, we need to add a little bit of description. Now we have, let's see, opens the input file and removes digital signature from it. We need to add description for the second parameter, which is important for, again, for developers that might be working with this function. And we say if not null and not empty string, let's see, file path to save resulting PE file, and we need to say or use file suffix on existing file. Just basically tells, you know, what this thing does since we just added here. Okay, so now we need to refactor existing processing of this input path. So if we scroll a little bit down, we will see that over here we reserve memory for it, and then we basically create this default path. So what we will need to do, we need to change this strategy a little bit. So first we need to move out this variable and declare it as null originally. And this is the variable that will hold this dynamically allocated array for us. Okay, and then we need to see over here, do we need to make an output file? Okay, so how do we know if the output provided is null or an empty string? Okay, well, probably this will help. Okay, then we need to generate output file name. And before we do that, let's null it out. Okay, so and then we can actually do all this stuff in there. So let's just copy it and paste it here as such. Okay, now we need to adjust the tabbing a little bit. Okay, so and then at the end, oops, too many. So in here we say that only if we have, only if we have an output file, which is this thing, we do all this stuff here. Okay, and then what we also need to do, we need to move this stuff at the very end here, and then we see free memory, but only if it's not null. I'll explain this at the end what this thing does, so I just need to refactor it first. Okay, so in here we do not create the file inside the scope. Instead we do it here. We have a little bit of a tabbing issue here. Let's bring it back. Okay, and here if we successfully generated our dynamic file name, we just say, I don't know, use it, and the dynamic name is this. Okay, so let's see what else. Now we need to adjust we need to adjust the way this new file name is used. It's no longer new name, it's output file name. So we remove it here, we remove it here, here, and we keep it here. Okay, so let's see if it's all done. Okay, that seems like it is. So let me explain what's going on. So we get here and we check, do we have the actual output file? We won't if it's null or if it's an empty string. Just to make it more consistent, if it's either of those, we just set it to null, and this is just kind of like our way of referring it to it later over here, where we can just check for null instead of doing both. Okay, so then we allocate our new file name from heap. We do all the processing like we did before. We make sure that, you know, we format it correctly, and if we get it, we actually set our output file name pointer to this newly allocated array, right? And then, or alternatively, if the user actually provided this thing for us, so if the user actually said, hey, here's the file path, so then we would not get here, and instead we would just check it again and start using it here. Okay, so in this case we open the file, create it, and, you know, do other things and check it, and at the end, if new file name was actually not null, which would be if we opened it here, we deleted free memory, or if it is null, if we used the one that was provided for us by the user, then this thing will be null and we will not have to delete anything. So I think this is pretty much it. So let's compile it. It builds all right, so let's see what happens. Okay, so our command line is working fine, so we can remove it. So at this case, let's see if we have any signature on this file, and we don't. So let's delete it. Just to test again, I'm going to go and fetch, well, let's say 32-bit version, put it over here. And again, as you can tell, it has digital signature. Let's go into general, take its file path. And if we go here, so in this case, it's an I parameter. And when, let's see, what was it? Let's just copy the file name. .exe. So without providing the O parameter, if we run it, okay, so we have success. The file was actually created and with no signature, so let's double check. Again, no signature, so we can delete it. And let's now try the O parameter. Now the O parameter, it doesn't matter how you specify it. Let's just say 123 exe, and it's not I, it's O. So now it should create 123 file. We run it, and here you go, success creating 123 file. And again, it starts fine, and if we move it, happen to move it, and look at it, as you can see, it doesn't have any signature. So as you can see, our small modification here worked. So let's just remove command line so that we don't create, empty files. Let's build release. Make sure it runs, and here you go, version 101, where I added some additional features and also removed bugs. So guys, this is just a small follow-up again to finish up what we started before, and I will finish on it right now, and thank you very much for watching.